the inheritance of lies. The cabin burned. Eleanor's gold lighter fell to the floor, and Anna's wrists bled against plastic zip ties as flames climbed the walls. In 20 minutes, there would be nothing left. In 5 minutes, there would be nothing of her left to find. 13 hours earlier, the attic had been silent. Dust hung in the air like suspended time. Anna's knees pressed against the rough, unfinished floorboards of her grandmother's attic. Boards that hadn't been walked on in years. Her fingers, already stained with gray dust, traced the rusted edge of a crowbar. The metal was cold despite the afternoon heat below. She wedged the iron tip into the narrow gap between two boards, her whole body angled against the leverage. The screech came first. A rusty nail being pulled from wood, a sound like bone cracking. Then resistance, tremendous resistance, as if the floor itself was refusing to give up its secret. She heaved, once, twice. Her forearm disappeared past the elbow into the dark rectangular void opening beneath the floor. The wood down there was different, smoother, deliberately hidden. Her fingers brushed against cold, polished walnut. She gripped what she found and pulled upward, muscles burning in her shoulders. The box emerged into the light. It was a dark walnut box, no larger than a document case, with brass hardware that had oxidized to a pale green in places. Engraved into the lid in scrolling script were the initials. E.V. Not her initials. Not her grandmother Elena's full name either, Elena Vance, but the letters that belonged to someone else. Someone her mother had spent 20 years calling disinherited, a drunk, a thief. Her thumb swept across the brass latch, clearing layers of grime that came away like skin. She pulled a silver skeleton key from her pocket. She'd found it an hour ago, buried at the bottom of her grandmother's jewelry box beneath costume pearls and broken silver chains. A key with purpose. A key that had been waiting for something. It slid into the keyhole. The click was sharp, metallic, echoing in the empty attic like a gunshot in a cathedral. The latch popped open by a fraction of an inch, and she heard the whisper of springs releasing pressure they'd held for decades. Inside, resting on red velvet that had faded to the color of old brick, was a thick parchment envelope sealed with wax. The seal was broken. Deliberately, she noted. Someone had already opened this and then resealed it badly, the wax cracked down the middle. She pulled out the envelope. A document inside, the typeface old-fashioned, the edges of the paper yellowed to the color of aged teeth. The header read in thick capitals, "Last Will and Testament of Elena Vance." The date was 1994. Her eyes darted across the cursive handwriting, the personal notes in her grandmother's elegant script, the legal declarations. Then her finger stopped. It stopped on a specific line, and she read it twice, then a third time, certain her vision was lying to her. I hereby bequeath the entirety of the Vance estate, including the holdings and properties, to my son, Arthur Vance. The name was underlined in thick black ink. Arthur Vance. The uncle who didn't exist in her mother's version of history. The uncle who was supposed to have been written out, excised like a tumor from the family legacy. Blood rushed in her ears. She sat back on her heels, the will shaking in her hands. The overgrown lawn stretched between the attic and the car, and Anna walked it quickly, the wooden box tucked under her left arm. The house behind her still smelled of lilies and closed caskets. The funeral had been 4 hours ago. She changed out of her black dress and into jeans and a sweater before coming up here, driven by a feeling she couldn't name, not quite curiosity, something sharper. Something like warning. A man stepped out from behind a rusted shed. He was thick-bodied, wearing a heavy canvas jacket despite the afternoon warmth. His face was obscured by a baseball cap pulled low. but she could see the thick line of his jaw, the way his hand was already reaching for her. Gravel crunched under his boots. Fast, aggressive, no preamble. The lunge came without words. His hand, calloused and broad, reached for the box. Anna twisted her hips hard, swinging the box away from his grasp, and at the same moment throwing her right elbow up and back, driving it toward where she guessed his collarbone would be. The impact was solid, bone on bone, a dull thwack that vibrated through her entire arm. The man grunted, his breath coming out forced, and she heard him stumble backward. But he recovered. He grabbed her shoulder, spinning her around with considerable strength, and slammed her backward against the corrugated metal wall of the shed. The impact knocked the air from her lungs. His forearm came up, pressing against her throat. Not gently, not a restraint, but a pressure that said, "Stay still or I will end this." Her vision started to narrow at the edges, black spots blooming. She kicked out hard, her boot finding his shin, and the pressure on her throat released just enough for her to suck in a breath. She opened her mouth and bit down on his forearm. Her teeth found the soft inside of his inner arm, and she bit hard enough to taste copper, salt and metal. His scream was high-pitched, almost feminine, and his grip loosened completely. She used the moment to shove the wooden box forward with both hands, driving it into his stomach like a piston. He staggered back, the air leaving his body in a rush, and he fell backward into a pile of scrap metal. Old pipes, bent frames, the detritus of 100 years of rust and abandonment. The crash was deafening. A symphony of metal on metal, of echoing clangs that seemed to go on forever. Anna ran. Her legs carried her across the remaining lawn toward her silver sedan. Keys fumbled in her shaking hand, the small rectangle of metal nearly dropping to the ground twice before her fingers gripped it. She threw the box onto the passenger seat and jammed the key into the ignition. The engine turned over. Once. Twice. Then caught, roaring to life. She looked in the mirror. The man was rising from the scrap metal, moving slow, favoring his left side. She didn't wait. Her foot found the accelerator, and the sedan lurched forward in a scatter of gravel, tires spinning until they caught purchase on the drive. Dust rose behind her in a cloud, thick and choking, and she didn't look back again. Her mother's house was a testament to control. Everything was placed with geometric precision. Pillows aligned on the sofa, books arranged by color on the shelves. Even the flowers in the vase positioned at identical heights. Eleanor herself sat in a wingback chair as if she'd been waiting for this exact moment. A delicate bone china cup raised to her lips. Her pinky extended in the way people do when they want the world to understand their refinement. Anna slammed the will onto the glass coffee table between them. The sound was sharp, deliberate, the kind of sound that said, "This is not a discussion." Eleanor didn't jump. Her hand remained steady as she set down her cup, the liquid inside barely rippling. The lace doily beneath it stayed perfectly positioned. Only her knuckles turned white as she gripped the cup's rim. "Explain this," Anna said, her voice shaking with something that wasn't quite rage, but was traveling in that direction. Grandmama left the entire estate to Uncle Arthur in 1994. Why was I told he was disinherited? Why was I told he was a thief? Eleanor laughed. It was a dry sound, rattling in her throat like loose coins in a jar. She didn't look at the will. She simply smoothed her silk skirt with deliberate, practiced movements, as if the gesture could wipe away any inconvenience. "Arthur was a drunk and a thief, Anna," Eleanor said, her voice flat and cold as concrete. "My mother was senile when she wrote that. We did what was necessary to preserve the family. Surely you understand that." Anna reached into the envelope again. Her fingers found something wedged into the bottom corner, something that shouldn't have been there. She ripped the side of the envelope open, tearing through decades-old parchment with violence. A photograph fell out. It showed her mother and Uncle Arthur shaking hands over a stack of cash. $100 bills. Lots of them. The photo was dated 1995, a year after the will was hidden, a year after Eleanor had claimed her brother was disinherited and dangerous. Anna flipped the photograph over. The handwriting on the back was unmistakable. Her mother's elegant cursive, the kind of handwriting that had signed checks and birthday cards and Christmas cards for decades. The words were, "Payment for silence. The box stays buried." Her hand began to shake so violently that the photograph fluttered from her fingers to the parquet floor. Eleanor's composure broke like thin ice. She lunged across the table, her hand becoming claw-like, desperate. Anna jerked back, clutching the photograph and the will to her chest, and Eleanor's momentum carried her halfway across the glass surface. Their eyes met. Eleanor's wild and frantic, Anna's cold with understanding. The teacup tipped over. Brown liquid spread across the table like blood, dripping onto Eleanor's expensive slacks. "You sold him out," Anna said, and her voice had become something else entirely. Something venomous. "You stole his life to buy your own." Eleanor's face crumpled, but she didn't respond. She was staring at the photograph now, at her own younger face in the image, as if she couldn't quite believe that version of herself had ever existed. The city at night had a particular smell. Rain and exhaust and the ghost of rotting fruit from the market district. Anna's boots splashed through a puddle, the reflection of a red neon motel sign shattering across the water's surface. Behind her, heavy footsteps. More than one person. The kind of footsteps that meant, "We've been sent to collect something." She ducked into the open side door of a warehouse. The interior was dim, lit only by what little moonlight penetrated the broken windows. The smell hit her immediately. Stale oil, rust, the particular mustiness of a place where nothing moved anymore. She could hear them behind her, entering through the same door, and she moved deeper into the darkness. A tall man in a leather jacket stepped out from behind a stack of wooden crates. The movement was deliberate, trained. He was holding a telescoping steel baton, and with a flick of his wrist, the baton extended with a metallic clack that echoed through the warehouse like a shot. The hanging bulb above them swayed, sending shadows dancing across the wall in hypnotic rhythms. Anna grabbed a heavy glass bottle from a nearby workbench. It had held something once. Maybe gasoline, maybe oil, maybe something worse. And its weight was substantial. The man swung the baton in a controlled arc aimed at her ribs. She ducked. The baton smashed into a wooden crate behind her with tremendous force, splitting the wood and sending splinters flying through the air like hostile confetti. She lunged forward before he could recover and smashed the bottle against his temple. The explosion of glass was deafening in the enclosed space. The bottle shattered on impact, and whatever liquid was inside, it was clear, it was pungent, sprayed across his face and leather jacket. His grunt of pain was sharp and involuntary, and he staggered backward, his hand coming up to his temple, blood mixing with the clear liquid. The second man rushed from the shadows before she could move. He tackled her around the waist, driving her backward with considerable momentum. They crashed into a stack of empty metal bins, and the collision was catastrophic. The bins collapsed in on themselves with a sound like the end of the world. They fell as a heap of tangled limbs and scraping metal, and Anna used the moment of impact to drive her elbow hard into his throat. He gagged, his hands loosening, and she scrambled upward and toward a rusted iron ladder. Her fingers gripped the cold metal, and she climbed fast, her boots finding purchase on the rungs. Below her, the first man was recovering, reaching upward. She kicked the ladder away from the wall with her boot, and he lunged for the top rung, missing by inches. The ladder fell with a heavy, conclusive bang against the concrete floor. Anna pulled herself onto the mezzanine level, disappearing into the darkness of the rafters above. For a moment, the only sound was her own breathing and the settling of metal and dust. Then the man looked up and shouted into a radio, static responding in bursts of white noise. She pressed herself against the cold metal of the upper structure and waited for what would come next. The basement apartment smelled like medication and resignation. Arthur sat at a kitchen table covered in legal papers, empty pill bottles arranged like a shrine to exhaustion. He looked at the will Anna placed before him, and for a moment, nothing moved in his face. Then he started to laugh, a dry, broken sound that might have been crying under different circumstances. The fluorescent light above them buzzed in that particular rhythm that drove people slowly insane. Buzz pop. Buzz pop. A rhythm like a heartbeat on the edge of failure. "She didn't tell you the rest, did she?" Arthur said, his voice hollow as a cave. "About the fire at the factory?" He pulled a floor safe from beneath the kitchen tiles, she hadn't even noticed it was there, and removed a police report bundle. The papers were thick, official, stamped with the weight of institutional authority. He slid a document across the table to her. Arson investigation. Suspect, Arthur Vance. Underneath was a bank statement showing transfers from Eleanor's account to a man named Thomas Marek. Marek. The name registered immediately. He was the man who had attacked her at the grandmother's house. The man with the scar. Underneath the bank statement was a handwritten note. Witness payment. Testimony for fire. "She paid him," Arthur said, his finger touching the bank statement. "Paid him to lie. He told the police he'd seen me starting the fire. The factory burned. 3 people died in the warehouse next door. And I did 12 years. Anna's skin had gone cold. She was reading the dates now. The bank statement was dated the day before Arthur's arrest. The police report was dated 1 week after the fire. She looked at her uncle's face and saw a landscape of destroyed years. His hair was gray. His teeth were bad. His hands shook slightly as he reached for a glass of water that was half empty. Or maybe that was just how much he'd managed to drink of it. "She needed me gone," Arthur continued, his voice assuming a kind of mathematical certainty. "Not dead. Just gone. Out of the way. Away from the family story. Away from the estate paperwork. If I was a convicted felon, I couldn't contest anything. Couldn't claim anything. Couldn't even ask questions." He reached into the safe again and removed a revolver. It was old-fashioned, the kind of gun that belonged to a different era. He laid it on the table and pushed it toward Anna. The metal was clean and oiled. In the fluorescent light, it looked almost beautiful, the kind of object that had purpose written into its design. "She's coming for the box," Arthur said, and his voice had become something like a whisper. "She won't stop at just your identity. She needs you gone to clear the title. The inheritance is a liability, Anna. It's not money, it's proof. And proof can put people in prison." Anna stood up, refusing the gun but grabbing the documents. She was reaching for the first police report when the sound came. A crash from the door, violent and deliberate. A flashbang grenade rolled into the room. The world became white. Absolutely, completely white. The sound that followed wasn't quite sound. It was pressure. It was pain. It was the shredding of the auditory system. Anna's ears rang with a frequency that seemed to be coming from inside her own skull. Dust and smoke billowed into the room. She could see shapes moving through the white haze, figures in tactical gear, weapons the methodical movements of people trained to do violence. She grabbed Arthur's arm. He was also disoriented, blinking, trying to orient himself. She pulled him toward the laundry chute in the corner, a relic from some previous era when this place had been something else. And they slid down together into darkness. They landed in a pile of coal that was damp and cold and smelled of ancient things. Anna's eyes watered from the dust. Above, she could see red laser sights dancing across the walls, sweeping back and forth like predatory creatures looking for prey. Arthur grabbed a rusted grate leading to the city's sewer system and wrenched it open. The sound was the screech of metal on metal, a protest against disturbance. Below was blackness and the sound of water moving. He plunged into waist-deep, murky water. The shock of cold was immediate and absolute. Anna followed, and the liquid soaked through her clothes instantly, bringing the temperature of her body down by several degrees in what felt like seconds. The water was dark, and it had things in it. The general filth of a city's waste system. And she didn't think too hard about what those things might be. They waded through the tunnel. Above, through a manhole cover, the beam of a high-powered flashlight cut through the dark, sweeping methodically through the space. The beam was only feet behind them, and it was moving fast. Boots on metal. Voices shouting orders. The sound of pursuit concentrated in a space that offered no escape. Anna's hands found a junction box set into the sewer wall. It was old, industrial, covered in a patina of corrosion and grime. She ripped it open, and her fingers found wires. Old copper wires, still carrying some kind of electrical current even in this abandoned place. She pulled. The result was violent. A shower of sparks erupted from the box, and the electrical crack sizzle was accompanied by a sudden darkness as every light in the tunnel system went out simultaneously. The high-powered flashlight above went dark as well. They waded faster, moving by touch and memory, and the faint sound of water moving beneath their feet. Anna pushed Arthur toward a side pipe, and they emerged 2 blocks away into a rainy alley. The rain was cold and real and refreshingly clean compared to the sewer water. She spotted a black SUV parked at the curb. The engine was idling, the silhouette of a driver visible in the front seat, smoking. Eleanor's security detail. Which meant Eleanor already knew. Which meant the trap had already been set. Anna's hands gripped the steering wheel of the stolen sedan. The black SUV was inches from her bumper, and she could see the driver's face twisted with concentration. The mountain road curved sharply ahead, and she took the turn at a speed that would have scared her yesterday. Yesterday seemed to be in another lifetime. The tires screamed on the wet asphalt. The cliff edge was just feet away from the car wheels, and on the other side of that edge was a drop that would end in stone. The SUV rammed her rear quarter panel. The impact was jarring, violent, a movement that translated directly through the frame of the car and into her bones. Her car fishtails. The guardrail is suddenly very close, very real, and the back of the sedan hits it with a glancing blow that sends glass from the taillight shattering into a shower of sparks and precious materials. She pulled the handbrake hard. The sedan spun 180 degrees. She was now facing the SUV, and the headlights of both vehicles illuminated each other in a moment of terrible clarity. She floored the accelerator. The sedan charged directly at the SUV in a game of chicken, a moment of supreme irrationality, a movement that said, "I don't care anymore." The SUV driver swerved at the last second. The vehicle clipped the rock face and flipped. Once. Twice. A massive tumble of black metal and glass, a rotation that should have killed everyone inside, and then it came to rest upside down in the center of the road. Steam hissed from the engine compartment. The wheels were still spinning in the air, a mechanical reflex, the last echo of forward momentum. Anna stopped her car. She got out, limping slightly. She found a tire iron in her trunk. She'd thrown it there months ago. And she approached the wreck. The light was changing, the pre-dawn grayness giving way to something that might become day. Thomas Marek crawled out of the driver's side window. His face was covered in blood. A thin rivulet ran from his temple, and his eyes weren't quite tracking. He saw Anna and reached for something. A knife, a gun, it didn't matter. But his hand didn't quite complete the motion. Anna didn't use the tire iron. She simply looked at him, really looked at him, for the first time. The scar on his temple, the one from the attic, hadn't opened. But the fresh blood from the wreck made it seem like he was wearing a mask of violence. "Where is Eleanor?" Anna asked. Marek tried to speak. His voice came out garbled. But he pointed with a shaking hand toward the access road heading deeper into the mountains. The cabin was the kind of place where people went to disappear. Anna found it because Arthur, despite being barely conscious, knew where it was. He'd been here before, in better days, when he'd still been family instead of liability. Arthur collapsed onto a dusty sofa the moment they crossed the threshold. He was clutching his chest, his face a sickly gray, his breathing becoming something ragged and desperate. Anna searched his bag frantically for medication. Pills, anything. But she found instead a modern legal folder. Inside was a receipt from a professional forger. It listed, "Vance Will, 1994 recreation, $15,000. The date on the receipt was 2 weeks old. Her hands began to shake. Arthur's eyes were still clear despite his physical deterioration. He reached out with a bloody hand. When he spoke, his voice was weak, but edged with something like satisfaction. "You were the only one," he said, barely more than a whisper. "The old woman would let near the attic. I needed you. I needed you to find the key." Anna pulled the silver skeleton key from her pocket. The small LED in the head was blinking red. A GPS tracker. She'd been carrying her location the entire time, a beacon leading Eleanor exactly where she needed to go. She looked at her uncle with a clarity that felt like ice water. He had used her. Eleanor had used her. Arthur and Eleanor had been playing a game together, and she had been the piece that moved according to their rules. The sound of heavy footsteps surrounded the cabin. The front door was kicked in with tremendous force. It was Eleanor, holding a small, elegant pistol. The kind of gun that looked like it came from a jewelry box. The kind of gun that had probably never been fired. The dawn light was behind her, creating a halo effect that made her look almost holy. "The box," Eleanor said simply. "Where is it?" "There is no box," Anna said. Her voice sounded strange to her own ears, distant. "The will you stole from the attic is a forgery. Arthur made it to draw you out, to prove what you'd do." Eleanor's hand trembled slightly. The gun wavered. "The real records aren't in a box," Anna continued. "They never were. Grandmama didn't trust anyone. She hid everything in the one thing you could never touch, her jewelry, a micro SD card in her locket. Police have already been sent the files. It was a lie. A good lie. A lie that depended on Eleanor's understanding that she was cornered, that the game was over, that the pieces had moved into a configuration she could no longer control. Eleanor's face changed. The moment of transformation was quick but complete. From predator to prey, from hunter to hunted. The police arrived as the sun crested the tree line. Eleanor didn't resist. She simply stood in the cabin, her hands uncrossed from her body, the small pistol at her feet. When the officers approached, she held out her wrists for the handcuffs with the kind of resigned acceptance that suggested she'd always known this moment would come. Anna stood on the porch and watched the blue and red lights flash against the white pillars of the house. Not her house, Never her house. The family house that had always belonged to someone else's vision of what family should mean. Inside the cabin, Arthur was being attended to by paramedics. They worked around him with practiced efficiency, loading him onto a stretcher, preparing him for transport. He was dying, she realized. Had been dying for a long time. The cancer or the trauma or the simple accumulated weight of years spent in darkness. It didn't matter which. She pulled a small deed from her pocket. It was real. The one thing Eleanor had never found, because it had never been hidden in the way Eleanor expected. It was a piece of property, a small plot of land in Anna's own name, transferred decades ago by her grandmother. A gift that had nothing to do with the estate or the inheritance, or any of the machinery of family and obligation. She tore up the forged will that Arthur had planted. Let the pieces fly. They looked like white birds in the wind, scattering across the property, dissolving into the distance. Inside the house, she moved through rooms that had seemed enormous when she was a child. The furniture was expensive. The walls were painted in colors that had been chosen by professional designers. Everything was perfect, and everything was empty. She didn't pack anything. There was nothing here that belonged to her. There had never been anything here that belonged to her. A taxi was waiting at the end of the drive. She'd called it while the police were cuffing Eleanor, while the paramedics were loading Arthur, while everything was becoming dust and ending and relief. She walked toward it without looking back. The long shadow she cast on the driveway stretched behind her, but she didn't look at it. She didn't need to see proof of her own existence. She knew she was here. She knew she was leaving. Inside the taxi, the driver pulled away from the house. Anna looked down at her hands. They were shaking. They were also clean. At least they looked clean. The grime and the soot and the evidence of the fire had washed away somewhere between the cabin and the house and the police cars and the slowly brightening morning. She pulled the gold locket from her pocket. It opened with a small click that sounded like the release of something held too long. Inside was not a micro SD card. There was no evidence, no proof, no secrets that had been waiting to be discovered. Inside was a photograph. Her as a baby. Her grandmother holding her, both of them smiling at the camera with a simplicity that suggested happiness was once a thing that could be casual, unguarded, real. She closed the locket. The city passed by the windows. Familiar streets becoming unfamiliar. The landscape shifting from the territory of her past into something else. The taxi driver didn't ask questions. He simply drove, and the radio played soft music, and the world continued its rotation regardless of who was destroying their families, or who was escaping, or who was beginning or ending, or simply existing in the space between. She closed her eyes.